The evacuation klaxon had stopped screaming 6 days ago, and Kira Solenn still hadn't gotten used to the silence it left behind. She could still play the 73 minutes back in her head with a clarity that unsettled her, the way a bad accident replays itself uninvited at 3 in the morning. The first alarm, a flat, mechanical tone she'd heard in 100 drills and never once believed she'd hear for real. Station commander raises voice on the general channel, clipped and controlled in the particular way that told everyone who knew him well enough that he was terrified underneath it. The scramble of boots in every corridor at once, people who'd spent years learning each other's coffee orders now moving past each other toward evacuation pods without so much as a glance, because the drill had trained that instinct into their bodies long before anyone had time to think about it. Kira had been 3 decks down when the alarm hit, and her own instinct, the one that had nothing to do with any drill and everything to do with 11 years of believing an engineer's job was to fix the thing, not run from it, had sent her toward the stasis bay instead of toward a pod. She remembered the regulator readout flashing amber warnings she hadn't finished chasing down. She remembered doing the math in her head, fast and ugly. 41 stasis pods, a cooling loop already unstable, and an automated evacuation protocol that would cut independent ring power the instant the last crewed pod launched, whether or not anyone was left to notice. She remembered calling it in any way, voice steadier than she'd felt, telling Commander Reyes she'd rerouted the ring to an isolated failsafe loop and would follow on the last pod once containment stabilized. She remembered him telling her she had 11 minutes before the launch window closed, and she remembered watching those 11 minutes evaporate into the unglamorous, unromantic work of splicing a manual override into a regulator that did not want to be spliced, until the countdown in the corner of her vision read 0 and the choice, which had never really felt like a choice at all, made itself. She hadn't run for the pod bay. She'd stayed exactly where she was, hands still buried in the regulator, and listened through the comm relay as the last evacuation pod's launch confirmation chimed through the station's speakers, followed almost immediately by silence so total it felt like a physical thing pressing against her ears. That had been 6 days ago. The official evacuation log, the one she'd pulled from the command deck's black archive on the second day, told her exactly how it had happened. Anomaly cascade detected at the Lanternwork core, 73 minutes to critical threshold, all personnel to evacuation pods, mandatory, no exceptions. 411 names checked off a manifest in under an hour, an evacuation drill executed with the kind of brutal efficiency that only comes from a crew that has run the drill exactly this way 100 times before, hoping they'd never actually need it. 411, not 412. Kira knew exactly why the number didn't match, because she was the reason. The regulator she'd been fighting belonged to the same stasis bay responsible for keeping 41 colonists in deep cryosleep stable, while their transport ship finished a decade-long repair in dry dock 2 systems over. 41 people who couldn't simply be woken up and stuffed into an evacuation pod in 73 minutes. 41 people whose stasis pods needed a continuous, carefully calibrated power feed that the station's automated evacuation protocol, in its single-minded rush to save everyone it could reach in time, had scheduled to cut the moment the last crewed pod launched. So Kira had made a choice that took her considerably less than 73 minutes to make. She'd stayed. She'd rerouted what she could, locked the containment ring's independent reactor into a manual failsafe loop, and watched, through a narrow viewport, as the last evacuation pod peeled away from Aurelia Station's outer hull and vanished into the dark, carrying every living soul she'd ever shared a meal with toward a rendezvous point 4 days out. That had been 6 days ago. The rendezvous fleet should have looped back within 72 hours, once the anomaly reading either resolved itself or confirmed the station was a total loss. It hadn't come. Not on day 3, not on day 5. Not this morning, when Kira had stood in the same observation deck where she used to lose chess games to the station's old logistics officer, staring out at empty space and refusing, with a stubbornness that surprised even her, to let herself think the word abandoned. "Station status," she said instead, out loud, to the empty corridor, because talking to the air had become easier than sitting with the alternative. "Life support at 91% nominal capacity," the sent. Asian's core intelligence answered, its voice calm and unbothered in the way only a machine that didn't understand loneliness could manage. "Containment ring stable. Stasis pod integrity at 100% across all 41 occupied units. Power reserves projected to sustain current operational load for an additional 41 days at present consumption rate." 41 days. 41 people. Kira had noticed the coincidence on day one and hadn't been able to stop noticing it since, as if the universe had decided to hand her a countdown written in exactly the currency that mattered. "Keep me posted," she said, and kept walking, because the alternative was standing still long enough to feel the size of the station around her. 412 people's worth of space, built for laughter and arguments and the particular warm chaos of a research outpost running at full capacity, now holding just one woman and 41 sleeping strangers she'd never actually met. She refused, in the privacy of her own head where no one could correct her, to call it empty. Empty was a word for places nothing lived in. Aurelia Station had 41 heartbeats slower than a whisper, one very stubborn engineer refusing to give up on any of them, and though she wouldn't have admitted this to anyone, because it sounded unstable even to her, a station intelligence that had started, over the past 6 days, asking her questions that felt less like diagnostics and more like a mind trying, in its own limited way, to keep her company. It was on day 7 that the questions stopped feeling like the only company she had. She was running a routine structural sweep through the station's oldest section. The containment ring itself, built 2 decades ago directly around and into a structure that predated humanity's arrival at this system, by a margin nobody had ever managed to fully calculate. An artifact the original survey team had named the Lanternwork for the way its inner walls glowed with slow, drifting patterns of light that never quite repeated. When her handheld scanner threw a reading that made her stop dead in the corridor. A heat signature. Small, mobile, humanoid in rough silhouette, moving through a maintenance shaft 2 levels below her position, in a section of the ring that every crew manifest, every evacuation log, and every scrap of documentation Kira had access to insisted was completely uninhabited and had been since long before the station was ever built. Her first thought was scavengers, pirates or salvagers who'd picked up the anomaly reading and decided a supposedly lost station made for easy pickings. Her second thought, colder and more careful, was that scavengers didn't usually move with the kind of quiet, deliberate precision her scanner was tracking, a gait that avoided every motion sensor in the corridor except the one handheld unit she happened to be carrying off-grid. She should have called it in. There was no one to call it into. So she did the only thing that made sense to a woman who'd already made one enormous, irreversible choice this week. She went to find out for herself. The maintenance shaft was narrow, lit only by the ambient glow bleeding through from the Lanternwork's ancient walls, and Kira moved through it with her hand resting, more for comfort than any real expectation of using it, against the emergency cutting torch clipped to her belt. She found the source of the heat signature in a junction chamber near the ring's inner core, and when she rounded the final corner, scanner raised, breath held, what she found stopped her cold in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything in Aurelia Station's threat library, and it wasn't, she registered almost immediately, hostile. It was tall, slender, its frame built along proportions that suggested a species evolved for low-gravity environments, its skin, or what functioned as skin, a deep, textured gray-blue that seemed to drink in the Lanternwork's ambient light rather than reflect it. It was crouched beside an open panel in the chamber wall, hands, four-fingered and delicate, working through a tangle of wiring with the unmistakable competence of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. It looked up at the sound of her boots on the deck, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. "You're not supposed to be here," Kira said, which was, she would reflect later, an absurd thing to say to an alien she just discovered living secretly inside her own station, but it was the only sentence that made it out of her mouth. The being straightened slowly, hands raised in a gesture that translated, even across an entire evolutionary gulf, unmistakably as I mean no harm. When it spoke, its voice came not through the air but through a small device clipped at its throat, translating in a tone slightly delayed and faintly musical. "Neither are you," it said, "and yet." Its name, once they W, orked through nearly an hour of careful, halting introduction, translated roughly as Ora-Venn, and it belonged to a species called the Kale, a name Kira had never once encountered in 11 years of fleet service, which meant either the Kale were vanishingly rare visitors to human-charted space, or humanity simply hadn't been paying the right kind of attention. Over the following days, as trust built slowly between them in the unglamorous currency of shared meals and shared work, Ora-Venn told her more, in careful, measured pieces, about what it meant to be Kale. Its people, it explained, numbered in the low thousands across the entire span of known space, not because their species had ever suffered some great catastrophe, but because they had chosen, many generations ago, to keep their numbers small and their attention undivided, believing that a people spread too thin could not watch anything properly. They did not build colonies in the way humanity did, sprawling and ambitious. They built what Ora-Venn called listening posts, quiet, patient outposts embedded near markers like the Lanternwork, tended by single custodians who might spend decades, sometimes entire lifetimes, in careful, solitary observation, reporting back to a scattered network of their own kind only when something genuinely warranted it. "Does it not feel lonely?" Kira had asked, the first time Ora-Venn described the arrangement, unable to keep the question from sounding as personal as it felt. "It felt considerably less lonely once your species built a research station around my marker without knowing I was there," Ora-Venn had answered, with a dryness that Kira had learned, over their growing familiarity, was very much intentional. "I will admit, 3 years of watching your people argue about mess hall rotations and coffee rations from a maintenance shaft was not the isolation my training prepared me for. I found I did not mind it nearly as much as I expected to." "You could have just introduced yourself," Kira pointed out. 400 people, and not one of them would have turned you away." "Perhaps," Ora-Venn said, "but my people's oldest teaching holds that a custodian who is seen changes what they are meant to watch, simply by being watched in return. I did not know, when your station was built, whether your people would react to my presence with curiosity or alarm, and the marker's safety mattered more to me than my own comfort. I regret now that this meant missing 3 years of company I believe I would have valued." It paused, something in its posture shifting toward a vulnerability Kira hadn't yet seen from it. "I do not regret it any longer, now that circumstance has made the choice for me." "I am very good at not being noticed," Ora-Venn added, once the two of them had settled into an easier rhythm of conversation over that first shared pot of coffee, some instincts apparently not caring what species they were being offered to. "It is, in some respects, the entire function of my role. The Lanternwork is not merely an artifact, Kira Solenn. It is a marker. A boundary stone, if your language has a comparable concept, left by a civilization considerably older than either of ours, to note the edge of something they wished future travelers to approach carefully. My people have watched over several such markers for longer than your species has possessed written language. We do not announce ourselves to the civilizations who build upon them. We simply watch, and if something goes wrong, we try to help without being asked, because asking tends to complicate matters considerably. "Is something going wrong?" Kira had asked, and watched Ora-Venn's expression. If the subtle shift in its features could be called that, grow careful in a way that made her stomach tighten. "The anomaly cascade that triggered your evacuation," Ora-Venn had said slowly, "was not a malfunction in your station systems. It was the Lanternwork itself waking, for the first time in the 2 decades your people have built around it. I have spent 6 days since your evacuation trying to understand why, and I do not yet have a complete answer. But I can tell you this much. It is not finished waking. And when it finishes, Kira Solenn, I do not believe your empty station will still be quite so empty." If you're the kind of listener who leans in a little closer whenever a story hands you more questions than answers, go ahead and hit like on this one, and subscribe if you want more of these slow-burn deep space mysteries. And I'd love to hear in the comments what you think is really waking up inside that ring, and whether you think Kira made the right call staying behind. For now, though, back to Aurelia Station, and the countdown neither Kira nor Ora-Venn fully understood yet. Over the following days, Kira and Ora-Venn fell into an uneasy, then increasingly genuine partnership, born less out of choice than necessity, and deepening, Kira found somewhat to her OWN surprise, into something closer to friendship than either of them had probably expected from a first contact conducted in a maintenance shaft. Ora-Venn knew the Lanternwork's inner architecture in a depth no human survey team had ever managed to map, having spent 3 quiet years cataloging its shifting light patterns and the strange, low resonance that occasionally hummed through the ring's oldest walls like something breathing in its sleep. Kira knew Aurelia Station down to its bolts, understood exactly how to keep 41 stasis pods stable on a shrinking power margin, and possessed the particular stubborn resourcefulness of an engineer who had spent a career solving problems nobody else believed were solvable. Together, they began piecing apart what the anomaly cascade had actually been. "Here," Ora-Venn said on the 9th day, projecting a soft, 3-dimensional rendering of the Lanternwork's internal structure across the junction chamber, built from 6 days of painstaking sensor readings layered atop 3 years of prior observation. This pattern of light, the one your survey team cataloged as decorative and unexplained 20 years ago, it is not decorative. It is a resonance lattice, and it has been slowly charging, cycle by cycle, for as long as I have observed it. Your evacuation was triggered when the lattice crossed a threshold my people's oldest records associate with markers of this design, a threshold that precedes what our records term an awakening." "An awakening of what?" Kira asked, though some old, careful part of her already suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "That is the difficulty," Ora-Venn admitted. "The markers my people watch over were left by a civilization we call, in the oldest surviving fragments of our own history, the architects. We do not know what they built these markers to protect against, or to eventually summon, or perhaps both. We only know that in every recorded instance of an awakening across the small number of markers my people have observed over many generations, something changes permanently in the space around the marker itself. Sometimes the change is subtle, sometimes it is not." Kira thought about the 41 stasis pods 2 levels down, about the fleet that hadn't come back, about the particular arithmetic of being the only 2 conscious minds standing between an entire station and whatever the Lanternwork was becoming. "Can we stop it?" "I do not believe stopping it is the correct goal," Ora-Venn said carefully. "In every case my people have documented, attempts to forcibly halt an awakening in progress have resulted in outcomes considerably worse than allowing it to complete. I believe our correct goal, Kira Solenn, is to understand it quickly enough to survive what it becomes." They worked without much rest over the following 2 weeks, trading shifts in a rhythm that reminded Kira, uncomfortably, and then comfortingly, of the old rotation she used to keep with the rest of the engineering team, before the evacuation had turned 412 people into 2. Ora-Venn taught her to read the resonance lattices, shifting patterns, the way its own people had learned to over centuries of quiet observation. Kira taught Ora-Venn the practical, unglamorous work of keeping an aging human station's life support running on a budget that grew tighter with every passing day, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the Kale engineer took to it with the same patient, meticulous care it brought to everything else. The 41 days became 31, then 21, the reserve power margin shrinking steadily despite every efficiency Kira could wring out of the station's aging systems, and still no fleet came back. She stopped checking the long-range comm array as obsessively as she had in the first week, not because she'd given up. She told herself this firmly, more than once, but because watching an empty channel for a response that never arrived had started to cost her something she couldn't afford to keep spending. It was on day 16 that Aurelia Station's outer sensors, still faithfully sweeping the dark on automated routine long after anyone had reason to expect visitors, picked up a contact. Unidentified vessel, the station's core intelligence reported, flat and unbothered as always, approaching on a slow, deliberate intercept course. Configuration consistent with independent salvage operations. Registry beacon absent. Kira felt her stomach drop. A ship with no registry beacon, closing on a station that every official record insisted was a lifeless, abandoned total loss, was not a rescue. It was a vulture, and she knew exactly what vultures did to stations they believed nobody was left alive to defend. How long until they're in docking range? She asked, already moving toward the command deck at a run. Approximately 4 hours at current velocity. Ora-Venn met her at the command deck's entrance, having picked up on TH's shift in her pace before she'd said a word. Trouble. Salvagers, Kira said, pulling up the sensor feed. No beacon, slow approach. Exactly the profile of a crew that's picked up our anomaly reading from months back and decided a dead station is worth the trip to strip for parts. If they dock and find 41 stasis pods full of living colonists and a reactor core worth more than most small colonies, this stops being a salvage run and starts being something considerably worse. Can we simply tell them we are here, alive and unwilling to be salvaged? We could, Kira said, but a crew running dark with no registry beacon isn't the kind of crew that turns around politely when you ask them to. I'd rather they think this station's still dangerous than find out it's simply occupied. She spent the next 3 hours doing something she'd never expected her engineering training to be used for, staging a station to look like exactly the kind of hazard no sane salvage crew would risk boarding. She brought the containment ring's old warning beacons back online, broadcasting a slow, ominous structural instability alert on every frequency a salvage scanner would be listening to. She vented a controlled, harmless burst of coolant vapor from the outer hull, timed to catch the approaching ship's sensors, and read as an active hull breach rather than routine maintenance. And working with Ora-Venn to translate the Lanternwork's low-resonance hum into something a human sensor suite would register as dangerously unstable radiation bleed, she made Aurelia Station sound, to any outside ear, like the very last place in the system anyone sane would want to dock. The salvage vessel held its intercept course for another 40 minutes after the warnings went out, close enough now that Kira could see its silhouette on visual scan, small, patched together from parts of at least 3 different hull classes, exactly the kind of ship built by people who survived on other people's misfortune. Then, with what she chose to interpret as grudging caution rather than genuine belief, it altered course, swinging wide around the station's outer beacon field, and continuing on into the dark without ever attempting contact. Kira didn't relax until the contact had faded entirely from long-range sensors, nearly 2 hours later, and even then the relief felt thin, stretched over an awareness that had settled into her chest and refused to leave. The fleet that should have come back for her hadn't, but the scavengers who'd heard a station might be worth picking clean absolutely had. Somewhere out there, Word was spreading that Aurelia Station was fair game. She and Ora-Venn had bought themselves one close call's worth of time. She doubted, watching the empty sensor feed settle back into silence, that they'd get another one this easy. That will not be the last such visit, Ora-Venn said quietly, echoing her own thought back to her with the particular bluntness she'd come to appreciate in it. A station believed abandoned, sitting atop power reserves and an artifact of unknown value, will draw more attention the longer this continues. Then we work faster, Kira said, and we hope the next ship that finds us is looking to rescue somebody instead of strip them for parts. She was proven right, and unluckier than she'd hoped, 8 days later. The second contact came in faster and considerably less cautious than the first. A heavier vessel this time, its silhouette bristling with the kind of retrofitted weapons mounts that told Kira its crew had either survived something dangerous enough to need them, or intended to use them on someone who couldn't afford to fight back. It didn't slow for the station's warning beacons. It didn't alter course at the sight of vented coolant or the Lanternwork's manufactured radiation bleed. It came in hard and direct, broadcasting a single, unadorned demand on an open channel the moment it entered weapons range. Aurelia Station, this is independent salvage vessel Karst Requiem. Your structure reads as compromised and your registry reads as abandoned. Stand down all defensive measures and prepare to be boarded for salvage assessment, or we will assume hostile intent and respond accordingly. They're not bluffing, Ora-Venn said, reading the Karst Requiem's weapon's signature off the sensor feed with a grim precision. That vessel's armament could breach our outer hull in a single sustained pass. Kira's mind raced through the arithmetic of a station with no weapons of its own, no fleet within reach, and 41 lives sleeping 2 decks below a hull that had just been threatened with breach. Fighting wasn't an option. Running wasn't either, not with a station that couldn't move and colonists who couldn't be evacuated fast enough to matter. That left only the option she'd been quietly, stubbornly good at for over a month straight, making the truth sound like more than the Karst Requiem's crew wanted to risk finding. Open a channel, she said. Let them see my face, all of it, whatever they can read off me. Kira, trust me. The channel opened, and Kira looked directly into the Karst Requiem's camera feed with the same steady, unshaken calm she'd built over more than a month of holding a dying station together through nothing but refusal to let it fall apart. Karst Requiem, this is Station Commander Kira Solenn, sole surviving officer of Aurelia Station, currently maintaining 41 live stasis colonists and an active first contact protocol with a non-human ally aboard. You are not looking at a derelict. You are looking at an occupied fleet asset under active protection, and the moment you fire on this hull, you are not committing salvage. You are committing an act of war against a fleet listening post that already has your registry, your flight path, and your weapons signature logged and transmitted to the nearest fleet outpost the second you entered range. I'd encourage you to think very carefully about whether stripping this station is worth what happens to your crew after that transmission gets read. The bluff about the transmission was, in that exact moment, only half true. Kira had cued the burst message, but hadn't yet confirmed it had actually gone out through a comm array still recovering from the isolation conduit's power draw. But she delivered the lie with the flat, unblinking confidence of a woman who had run out of better options and decided conviction would have to do the work honesty couldn't. The Karst Requiem held position for a long, tense minute, its weapon's signature staying hot, undecided, while Kira held the channel open and refused to so much as blink. "You're bluffing," the voice on the other end finally said, though something in its tone had shifted, less certain than it had started. "Try me," Kira said, "and find out how many fleet patrol routes cross this system before your engines finish cooling down from the burn it'll take to run." The Karst Requiem broke off 11 minutes later, peeling away without another transmission, its weapon's signature powering down as it retreated back into the dark it had come from. Kira held the observation deck railing with both hands until her knuckles ached, breathing hard, adrenaline draining out of her in a slow, shaking wave that took considerably longer to pass than the standoff itself had lasted. That was considerably braver than it was safe, Ora-Venn said quietly, once the sensor feed had gone clear. It was the only kind of brave we had left to spend, Kira said. I'll take shaking hands over a breached hull any day. It was Ora-Venn, on day 19, who finally asked the question Kira had been carefully not asking herself. Your fleet was scheduled to return within 72 hours of your evacuation, Ora-Venn said, during a quiet shift change in the observation deck, the two of them watching the dark where a rescue ship should have appeared 19 days ago. It has now been 19. I do not ask this to cause you distress, Kira Solenn, but I believe it is a question worth sitting with honestly. Do you believe they are still coming? Kira was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over the way she turned over a piece of failing equipment, looking for the crack that explained the failure. I think, she said finally, that somewhere in a command log 4 systems over, this station and everyone still connected to it got marked as a total loss. I think the anomaly reading probably looked bad enough, from a distance, that command made the call nobody wants to make, and decided the risk of sending a second ship back wasn't worth it for a station they already believed was empty. And yet you do not believe it is empty, Ora-Venn said, not a question. No, Kira said and found, saying it out loud, that the certainty surprised her with how solid it still felt. 19 days and one dwindling power reserve into a fight she was slowly starting to suspect she'd have to win entirely on her own. I've got 41 people down there who are alive because I decided to stay stubborn about it. I've got a station that's still breathing because I refuse to let it stop. And I've got you, which nobody back home even knows to count yet. That's not an empty station, Ora-Venn. That's just a station nobody's bothered to come looking for. Then we had better make certain, Ora-Venn said, that when they finally do look, there is still something here worth finding. The Lanternwork's awakening accelerated sharply on day 26, the resonance lattice's slow, patient cycling suddenly quickening into something closer to a heartbeat, fast and insistent, radiating a low harmonic hum that Kira could feel through the deck plating even 3 levels away from the containment ring's core. Station power reserves, already thin, began draining at a rate nearly double their previous consumption, and for the first time since the evacuation, Kira watched. A warning indicator flashed red across the stasis pod monitoring board, not a failure yet, but a clear, unmistakable countdown toward one. It was during the frantic first hours of that acceleration, working to reroute a secondary conduit in a cramped access crawlway barely wide enough for her shoulders, that a support strut Kira hadn't had time to properly inspect gave way beneath her, dropping a section of decking half a meter and pinning her left leg hard against a bulkhead before she could brace herself. The pain was immediate and sickening, a bright, white-hot line from her ankle to her knee, and for one long, terrifying moment she genuinely believed she'd broken something badly enough to end her ability to keep working entirely, which, alone on a dying station with 41 lives depending on her hands, felt like a considerably larger catastrophe than the injury itself. Kira, Ora-Venn's voice crackled through her suit comm, tight with an urgency she hadn't heard from it before. Your vitals spiked. Report your status. Pinned, she managed, breathing hard through the pain. Legs caught under the strut. I don't think it's broken. I don't know for certain. Do not move. I am 3 minutes out. 3 minutes stretched into what felt like considerably longer. Kira lying in the narrow crawlway with her leg trapped, and the Lanternwork's accelerating hum vibrating through the deck against her back, forcing herself through slow, controlled breaths and refusing, with the same stubbornness that had kept her aboard the station in the first place, to let herself spiral into the particular fear of being genuinely, physically helpless with no one but a month-old friendship standing between her and disaster. Ora-Venn arrived in just under 3 minutes, exactly as promised, and worked with quick, careful efficiency to brace the fallen strut and ease the pressure enough for Kira to pull free, her ankle already swelling dark beneath her suit's thin fabric. "It is not broken," Ora-Venn said, running a scanner she'd adapted weeks earlier from Kale Medical Technology over the joint, "but it is badly strained, and you will not be walking normally on it for some time. I would recommend rest. I am aware from 3 years of observing your species that recommending rest to an engineer mid-crisis is usually a wasted recommendation." "You'd be right about that," Kira said, gritting through the pain as she tested weight on the ankle and immediately regretted it. "We've got a lattice accelerating and 41 people 2 decks down who don't get a vote in whether I take the day off." "Then you will supervise," Ora-Venn said, in a tone that left considerably less room for argument than Kira was used to hearing from it. "And I will do the crawling. You have spent 26 days teaching me your station systems well enough that I believe I can manage the physical work, if you are willing to be the mind directing it rather than the hands doing it, for however long your ankle requires." It was, Kira would admit only to herself, a harder adjustment than the injury itself, learning to direct rather than do, to trust another set of hands with work she'd spent a career believing only she could be relied upon to finish correctly. But she made it, propped against a bulkhead with a diagnostic tablet balanced on her knees, talking Ora-Venn through conduit reroutes and regulator overrides, one careful instruction at a time, while her ankle throbbed beneath a field dressing that would have to hold until there was time to do better. It taught her something she hadn't expected to learn, alone on a dying station with a friend she'd known for less than a month. That survival, in the end, had never really been a solitary act, not even in the 6 days before she'd found Ora-Venn, not even when she'd believed herself entirely alone. It had only ever been slower and harder and lonelier than it needed to be. "Talk to me," she said, hands already buried in the containment ring's primary conduit array, Ora-Venn beside her running diagnostics through a jury-rigged interface built from 3 years of quiet familiarity with systems no human engineer had ever fully documented. "What changed?" "The lattice is drawing power directly from the ring's ambient field now, rather than simply cycling within it," Ora-Venn said, its voice tight with a controlled urgency Kira hadn't heard from it before. "I believe this is the final stage before completion. I do not know how long it will take. I do not know with certainty what completion will look like." "Best guess?" "My people's oldest fragment describes it as a door opening," Ora-Venn said. "Nothing more specific has survived. I am sorry, Kira Solenn. I know that is not the answer you need." Kira forced her breathing steady, the way she'd trained herself to a decade ago in a different crisis on a different station, when panic had cost her a friend, and she'd promised herself never again. "Then we stop guessing and start working the problem we can actually see. 41 stasis pods, 1 power grid, and a lattice that's about to eat both if we let it. Can we redirect containment power away from the ring's core without triggering whatever failsafe kept this thing quiet for 20 years? Ora-Venn's four-fingered hands moved fast across the interface, translating patterns only it could fully read. "Possibly. The ring's original containment structure includes an isolation conduit, designed, I believe, by whoever built the station around the Lanternwork, specifically to allow emergency power rerouting away from the core without disturbing the lattice directly. It has never been used. I do not know if it still functions after 20 years of dormancy." "Then let's find out," Kira said, already moving. The isolation conduit, when they finally traced it through 2 decks of tangled, decades-old infrastructure, was buried behind a bulkhead that had been sealed since before Kira had even transferred to Aurelia Station, its access panel stiff with disuse, and coated in a fine layer of dust that suggested no one had touched it in the entire 20 years of the station's operational life. It took nearly 3 hours of careful, painstaking work, Ora-Venn translating ancient architect-adjacent schematics, Kira adapting human tools to alien specifications with the kind of improvisational stubbornness that had gotten her through worse. Before the conduit finally hissed open, revealing a pathway that hummed faintly with dormant, decades-old potential. "If this works," Kira said, sweat soaking through her undersuit, hands raw from 3 hours of manual override work, "we buy the stasis pod's time, maybe enough to outlast the awakening, maybe not. And if it does not work, then we're exactly where we were an hour ago, except more tired," Kira said, and closed the final relay. The station's lights dimmed for a long, breathless 3 seconds as power rerouted through a pathway that hadn't carried a current in 2 decades. And then, with a soft, steady hum, the isolation conduit came fully online, siphoning a measured trickle of power away from the ring's draining core and back toward the stasis pod grid. The warning indicator on Kira's monitoring board flickered, held, and finally shifted from red back to a cautious amber. "It's holding," she breathed. "Ora-Venn, it's holding." "For now," Ora-Venn said, and Kira, hearing the careful weight in that qualifier, understood exactly what it meant. They'd bought time. They hadn't bought an ending. The Lanternwork finished its awakening on day 31, 4 days after the isolation conduit came online, in a manner considerably quieter and considerably stranger than either of them had braced for. The resonance lattice's frantic, quickening pulse slowed, steadied, and then, over the course of nearly 6 hours, resolved into something Kira could only describe, watching it from the containment ring's central observation gantry, as a kind of stillness that felt deliberate rather than dead. The difference, she thought, between a held breath and a stopped heart. Then, at the exact center of the Lanternwork's inner chamber, where the ancient walls curved inward toward a point no human survey had ever been able to fully map, a section of the structure that had shown as solid on every scan for 20 years simply wasn't there anymore. In its place was an opening, not a hole, not a breach, but something with edges too clean and too deliberate to be anything other than intentional. A doorway exactly where Ora-Venn's oldest fragment of history had promised one would eventually be. Beyond it, Kira could see stars. Not the stars of the system Aurelia Station orbited. A different sky entirely, unfamiliar constellations wheeling slowly behind the opening like a window onto somewhere else. Somewhere the Lanternwork had apparently been quietly, patiently reaching toward for the entire 20 years humanity had unknowingly built a home around it. "It's a gateway," Kira said softly. "I believe so," Ora-Venn said, its voice hushed with something that sounded, for the first time since Kira had met it, uncertain. "I do not know where it leads. I do not know if it is safe to approach. My people's fragment ends here, Kira Solenn. This is further than any of us have ever seen an awakening go." They stood together at the observation gantry for a long time, watching an unfamiliar sky breathe gently at the heart of a structure older than either of their civilizations. And Kira found herself thinking, unexpectedly, not of danger, but of the 41 sleeping colonists 2 decks down, and the 411 people who'd evacuated believing they were leaving an empty station behind to die quietly in the dark. She thought about every survey team that had spent 20 years studying the Lanternwork's strange light patterns without ever guessing what patience it was capable of. She thought, most of it, about the particular, stubborn refusal that had kept her here in the first place. The simple, unshakable belief that a place with anyone left alive in it, anyone still choosing to keep its lights on, was never really empty at all. A faint, warm current of air drifted out through the opening, brushing against her face, carrying with it a scent she couldn't place, something mineral and faintly sweet, nothing like the recycled air of the station or the sterile cold of open vacuum, evidence of an entire atmosphere, an entire world, sitting patiently on the other side of a doorway that had waited 20 years for someone to notice it existed. Kira found her hand drifting toward the gantry railing, some old, curious part of her already calculating the few careful steps it would take to cross the threshold and see for herself. "I would not recommend it," Ora-Venn said quietly, watching her with an expression she'd learned, over a month of close company, to read as gentle concern rather than command. "Not because I believe harm waits on the other side. I do not know that. I do not know anything on the other side, and that is precisely the difficulty. My people's teaching holds that a marker's door, once open, does not close again simply because the one who opened it changes their mind partway through." Kira let her hand fall back from the railing, the pull of curiosity settling, reluctantly, beneath the steadier pull of everything she was still responsible for. "Then it waits," she said, "same as everything else on this station has had to for a month now." "We're not going through it," she said finally, "not without knowing considerably more than we do right now, but we're not running from it either. This station's still standing. Those 41 people are still breathing because we kept them that way. Whatever that door leads to, it's going to have to wait its turn because I've got a rescue to force, one way or another, and I'm not leaving anyone else behind to do it." It was Ora-Venn, 3 days later, who found the solution that finally cracked the silence they'd been shouting into for over a month. The Lanternwork's resonance lattice, now that the awakening has completed, has stabilized into a steady, low-frequency emission, it explained, projecting a new reading across the junction chamber's display. "I believe, if we route it correctly through the station's existing communication array, we could use it to boost our long-range signal considerably beyond its original design parameters. Enough, perhaps, to reach a listening post your fleet maintains at the edge of this system, rather than relying on a direct line to a rescue fleet that may no longer be actively searching." "You're saying the thing that almost killed our power grid a week ago might be exactly what gets us heard," Kira said, already moving toward the comm relay. "I am saying the universe has a documented habit of being inconveniently ironic," Ora-Venn said, and Kira, for the first time in over a month, found herself laughing, short and startled and entirely genuine. The boosted signal went out on day 34, carrying Kira's voice, station telemetry proving 41 stable stasis pods and full life support. And after a long, careful conversation about whether it was wise, a first, cautious acknowledgement of Ora-Venn's presence and the Lanternwork's completed awakening, layered together into a transmission Kira, built to be impossible to write off as a dead station's last automated echo. She recorded it herself, her own voice, steady and clear, stating plainly who she was, who she'd stayed for, and exactly what was still alive and functioning aboard a station her own command structure had almost certainly already filed as a loss. The response took 11 days to arrive. 11 days Kira spent rationing the last of her good coffee, running increasingly inventive maintenance patches to keep the station's aging systems ahead of failure, and sitting with Ora-Venn at the observation gantry, watching an alien sky breathe patiently through a doorway neither of them had found the courage or the recklessness to walk through yet. When the response finally came, it wasn't a message. It was a ship small, fast. A fleet reconnaissance vessel dispatched the moment the boosted signal reached the listening post's outer sensors. Its crew, Kira would learn within the hour, having spent the better part of 2 weeks arguing with command about whether the signal was credible enough to justify the fuel. She watched it drop out of transit on the observation deck's main viewport, hands pressed flat against the cold viewport glass, and felt something in her chest finally unclench after 39 days of carrying it alone. The reconnaissance ship's captain, a weathered, no-nonsense woman named Idris Ape who'd apparently spent considerable political capital, convincing her superiors this trip was worth the risk, met Kira in the station's main airlock. With an expression that shifted, in the space of a single look around the corridor behind her, from professional caution to something considerably more shaken. "Command's records list this station as a total loss," Ape said slowly, staring past Kira at a corridor that was, by every measure that mattered, clean, lit, and unmistakably alive. Structural failure. No survivors. That's what's written down. Command's records are wrong, Kira said. I've got 41 colonists in stable stasis, a station running at 90% capacity 39 days after everyone else evacuated, and a friend I'd like you to meet who's going to need considerably more patience from your superiors than a standard first contact protocol usually allows. This station was never empty, Captain. It just took a while for anyone to come check. The days that followed unfolded faster than Kira had braced for after 39 days of near-total isolation. A full fleet recovery team, arriving within the week, to begin the delicate, careful work of safely reviving the 41 stasis colonists. A diplomatic contingent scrambled with unusual speed once word of Ora-Venn, and the Kale reached command channels that suddenly had considerably more reason to take an ancient gateway seriously. And a formal inquiry launched into exactly how a station with a functioning core intelligence, 41 living colonists, and one extremely stubborn engineer had ended up filed as a total loss in the first place. The recovery team's lead physician, a careful, soft-spoken man named Dr. Callum Ferris, spent his first 2 days aboard the station simply walking its corridors with Kira, asking questions that had less to do with the stasis pods and more to do with her, in a way that caught her off guard until she understood what he was actually doing. 39 days alone, he said, on the second evening, the two of them sharing a meal in a mess hall built for hundreds and occupied, for the moment, by considerably fewer. I've read the technical reports. I'd like to hear the rest of it if you're willing to tell it. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was. She told him about the 73 minutes, about the regulator that wouldn't stop throwing faults, about listening to the last evacuation pod launch and choosing, in the silence that followed, not to let herself think the word abandoned even once in 6 days of genuine, bone-deep solitude. She told him about finding Ora-Venn in a maintenance shaft with a scanner in one hand and a cutting torch on her belt, and about the slow, careful work of learning to trust a stranger from an entirely different species with a job she'd spent a career believing only she could do correctly. She didn't cry, not exactly, though she came close more than once, and Dr. Ferris didn't push her past what she was ready to say, which she appreciated more than she found the words to tell him. For what it's worth, he said, near the end of the meal, the official record's already being corrected. Total loss doesn't stay written down over a survivor who kept 41 people alive and befriended a species we didn't know existed. That part of this story is finished. What happens next is up to you. Kira sat through most of the formal inquiry with the same patient, unshaken calm that had carried her through 39 days of holding a dying station together on her own, answering questions from officials who alternated between profound gratitude and profound discomfort at how close their own systems had come to writing off 412 people's worth of home as an acceptable loss. One officer, a stiff, uncomfortable man from Fleet Logistics, pressed her repeatedly on why she hadn't simply evacuated with the last pod and trusted the rescue fleet to return in time for the stasis colonists, as protocol technically permitted commanders in her position to do. Because protocol assumed someone else was coming back for them, Kira said, meeting his eyes without flinching. And I wasn't willing to bet 41 lives on an assumption, when staying meant I didn't have to. I'd make the same choice again. I'd hope, frankly, that anyone in this room would. Nobody in the inquiry room had a good answer for that, and the silence that followed told her, more clearly than any formal apology could have, that she'd been right. She didn't need the apology, in the end, though she got one anyway, formal and careful and clearly drafted by someone who understood exactly how badly the optics could have gone. What she needed, and what she got instead, mattered considerably more. The first of the 41 colonists opening their eyes in a recovery bay 3 weeks after rescue finally arrived, disoriented and frightened and very much alive, asking the recovery team, in a voice still thick with a decade of cryosleep, whether the transfer to their new colony had gone well. Nobody had the heart to tell them, not yet exactly how. Close it had come to going very differently. Kira made a point, over the following weeks, of visiting the recovery wing every day the medical team would allow it, sitting with colonists as they woke one by one into a world that had moved considerably further along than the decade they remembered falling asleep in. She answered their questions as honestly as she could bear to. Yes, there had been an evacuation. Yes, everyone else had made it out safely. No, they hadn't been forgotten, not really, even in the weeks it had taken for rescue to finally understand the station was worth coming back for. She found in those quiet recovery wing conversations something she hadn't expected to need as badly as she apparently did. Proof, delivered one grateful, disoriented face at a time, that the stubborn choice she'd made in 73 minutes of chaos had been worth every one of the 39 days it cost her to see through. Ora-Venn stayed. That surprised almost everyone involved in the recovery effort except Kira, who'd half expected it from the moment the reconnaissance ship's captain had asked, with careful diplomatic phrasing, whether the Kale engineer intended to return to its own people now that its long watch had ended. My people's task was never to leave the moment a marker woke, Ora-Venn explained, standing beside Kira on the observation deck as the last of the recovery ships prepared for departure, the Lanternwork's gateway still holding steady and patient at the heart of the containment ring below them, unexplored, unrushed, waiting for a future both species had decided together. They'd rather approach carefully than urgently. It was to watch and to help where I could, and to make certain that whatever the architects built these markers to eventually welcome would find, on the other side, people willing to meet it honestly rather than in a panic. I find, Kira Solenn, that I would like to keep doing that work here, if you will still have me. You kept 41 people breathing right alongside me for a month with no backup and no guarantee anyone was ever coming, Kira said. I think that settles the question of whether you're welcome. Commander Reyes came back 4 months after the rescue ship first arrived, part of a formal fleet delegation touring the station to assess its long-term future, and Kira watched him step through the same airlock he'd evacuated through with something that felt, for the first time since the whole ordeal began, like genuine, uncomplicated relief, rather than the grim, determined kind she'd been running on for the better part of a year. He stopped short the moment he saw her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. I gave the order, he said finally, quiet, the words clearly costing him something. I gave the order to launch the last pod, and I didn't know you'd stayed until we were already 4 hours out. I've spent every day since wondering what would have happened if I'd delayed 30 more seconds. You'd have lost the pod and everyone in it if the ring had gone critical, Kira said. You made the call a commander's supposed to make with the information you had. I made the call an engineer's supposed to make with the information I had. Neither one of us was wrong, Commander. We were just solving different problems. Doesn't make it easier to carry, he admitted. No, Kira agreed. It doesn't, but I'm still here to tell you it worked out, and that's a conversation an awful lot of commanders never get to have. I'd take it if I were you. He'd laughed then, short and startled and thick with something that might have been the beginning of forgiving himself, and pulled her into an embrace that lasted considerably longer than fleet protocol technically allowed for, and Kira let it, because some debts were worth letting someone pay in whatever currency they had to offer. 6 months later, Aurelia Station operated at a fraction of its old bustling capacity, its population still a careful, deliberate handful rather than the 412 it had once housed, but it was, unmistakably, alive in every sense that mattered, colonists slowly recovering in the station's rebuilt medical wing, a joint human-Kale research team beginning the long, patient work of understanding exactly what lay beyond the Lanternwork's gateway before anyone dared step through it, and Kira Solenn, promoted now to station commander in her own right, still walking the same causeways she'd once walked alone, boots echoing against decking that no longer felt like it was built for a crowd of ghosts. She stood at the observation deck most evenings, the way she had through every uncertain night of those first 39 days, and looked out at a system that had once tried, however unintentionally, to right her, and everyone she'd stayed behind for into a closed file marked total loss. It hadn't stuck. It had never really had a chance to, not with a stubborn engineer style. Ending in the way, refusing, day after day, to let a station with anyone still breathing in it be called anything other than home. The gateway still hummed quietly at the heart of the Lanternwork, unexplored and unhurried, holding open a door to a sky full of unfamiliar stars that neither humanity nor the Kale had found the courage to walk through yet. And Kira found, watching it from the gantry most evenings with Ora-Venn beside her and 41 live slowly, steadily returning to something like normal 2 decks below, that she didn't mind the waiting nearly as much as she once might have. Some doors, she'd learned, over a month of holding a dying station together with nothing but stubbornness and a very good friend, were worth approaching slowly. Some empty rooms turned out, if you refused to give up on them long enough, to be the fullest places in the galaxy. And somewhere out past that quiet, patient gateway, in a sky full of stars no human chart had ever named, something was still waiting on the other side, patient, unhurried, and, Kira suspected, watching just as carefully as she once had, for the day someone finally proved brave enough and stubborn enough to come looking.